There's no doubt that the US and China have reached a crossroads. The two major world powers have radically divergent points of view on how to shape the world economically, legally, culturally, and even militarily. You might have heard some people say we've entered an era of great power competition. Others refer to China as the United States' pacing threat. And some, like my guests today, believe we are in the beginning of a new Cold War. Matthew Kroenig and Dan Negrea are the authors of We Win, They Lose: Republican Foreign Policy and the New Cold War. Both are esteemed experts in the field of foreign policy and national security. At a time when many say the Republican Party is fractured over foreign policy, their book offers a plan to win the new Cold War with China by fusing the ideologies of the Trump and Reagan administrations. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me. I'm really excited to speak with you about this new book you have coming out. If you would, just give us a very brief summation of what the book's about and why you chose to write it.
All right, I'll start us off. So the world is at a very dangerous moment. A major war in Europe, major war in the Middle East, trying to deter China from attacking Taiwan. So maybe the most dangerous security environment we've faced in decades. And Dan and I originally thought we should write a first draft of the next administration's national security strategy so that when they come in, they're not scrambling, they have something ready to go. And so that was the major motivation. And then as we were working on the book, we were concerned about some people saying there are big divides within the Republican Party between the traditional Reaganite wing and the Trumpian wing. And actually, Dan and I thought that on the major issues that the Republican Party is largely united. And so that became a central theme of our book on Trump-Reagan fusion for uniting the party on foreign policy and winning the new Cold War with China and its revisionist friends and allies.
So of course, I agree with everything that Matt said. I always agree with Matt. I would add a few things. Number one, we thought it is very important to establish the fact that we are in a Cold War. Out of this definition of this period, then derives a seriousness of purpose. It is not a period like any other. It's a period that we characterize as a Cold War. And whenever you have the term war in defining something, even if it's a Cold War, that means we need to be purposeful in what we do in our foreign policy. So that's number one. The next thing that we wanted to do, and it's again in the subtitle of the book, is we are defining this Cold War from the perspective of the Republican Party. And the title of the book then is We Win and They Lose, which is, of course, Reagan's quote. And we add there the concept that we need to win. We need a strategy to win, not to muddle through, not to make it through this period without trouble, but we need a strategy to win. And finally, we also define the new axis of evil, which are our adversaries in this Cold War, which again, we thought it's important. So we wanted to provide clarity as to where we are and where we want to go.
That's a great summation. And I think your work is very timely, and I think a lot of folks in the past have sometimes, as Matt noted, criticized, the Republican administration for not being on board. But yeah, when you come down to brass tacks, you look at the defense strategies and a lot of the policy put out, it's pretty clear that on the 40,000 foot level, there's a lot to be agreed upon. Now, the details, of course, in any situation are going to be, hashed out. But for the most part, I think you're spot on there. I think one thing before we get into the meat of the book, I think one thing that's really important is talking a little bit about your individual backgrounds and how that informs your policy prescriptions and the way you've written the book itself. Dan, I find your background particularly interesting vis-a-vis a Cold War or a new Cold War, because you obviously, with your background, lived the last Cold War, coming from a communist country. If you could just tell us a little bit about that experience and how it's informed you going forward.
Yeah, thank you, Russ. After 1990, 1991, I never thought that my experience in living in a communist country until I was 24 years old, I came here 40 or so years ago. I never thought it would be relevant for foreign policy again. But here we are again. Of the four countries that we are defining as our adversaries in this Cold War, China has been ruled by the Chinese Communist Party. North Korea is still a communist country. And Russia, even though it changed the label, the people in the leadership are ex-communists, and the practices that they have are still communist. So what is relevant from my background in addressing the current situation? So I will make two observations and then a practical takeaway. The two observations are: number one, when we talk about Russia, about China, about North Korea, we are not talking about their peoples. We are talking about the rulers of those countries that have interests that do not represent the interests of their people. And they don't care about the living standard of their people. They don't stand for election. So that's one point. The second point is they're all terribly afraid that when the people rise up, they will face retribution. When we think of a transition from communist to capitalist, we think of the reunification of East Germany with West Germany. But Putin gave interviews, and he's thinking of what happened to Saddam Hussein, what happened to Gaddafi, what happened to Milosevic. And may I add what happened to the Ceausescu's in Romania, where they caught them and they shot them. So they are going to be ruthless in defending their position at the top. That's number one. Number two, the people in those countries know that there is a life of freedom and they aspire to it, which leads me to a practical point. We should use the information tool to undermine these countries, to show their peoples of how free peoples can live in other parts of the world. And that's the greatest fear that the rulers of those countries have.
Yeah, that's great. That's very helpful. And I think that it is interesting that, here we are again, right? It's fascinating. When I first, got into foreign policy as a student, I remember I was studying the Arab Spring because that was what was happening at the time. And everyone said, Russ, that's the future. You got to learn Arabic. You got to figure that out. The days of the Russia threat and, China's going to open up and become a grand, trading partner and maybe even get free one day. It was fascinating. I remember as I transitioned to studying more China-centric information, this is only 10, 15 years ago, I was criticized for it because folks were thinking that was a fait accompli. It was very interesting to see how quickly things have shifted back to the situation that you described. But I think someone who's lived it themselves, Matt, you've had a lot of different hats over your career. Obviously currently a professor at Georgetown and with the Atlantic Council. But tell us a little bit about your background and how it has informed you and how it's influenced the book.
Yes, well, I also grew up in an exotic location, St. Louis, Missouri, in the United States, and wasn't really interested in foreign policy as a young person. I thought I was going to be the next Michael Jordan for a while. God had different plans. And in college, I got interested in in foreign policy, but didn't really know much about it. So I applied to graduate school and got into the PhD program at University of California, Berkeley. So went out to Berkeley for a while. And growing up in Missouri, I thought I was, I never really thought of myself as political. I was just normal. And spending some time in Berkeley made me realize, oh, maybe I'm a conservative. I think a little bit differently than a lot of the people here. And to your point about doing, about how what is important changes, I think it is important for people to focus on what they enjoy. Because this was early 2000s, I was interested in nuclear weapons. And many of my advisors were saying that's Cold War thinking, it's completely irrelevant. But I decided I wanted to study that anyway. And now here we are, of course, nuclear weapons are back at the center of international politics. And then from Berkeley, I moved to Washington, started as a professor at Georgetown, but being in Washington and doing what I'm doing, a lot of opportunity to engage in other things. So I worked for a while in the Defense Department during both the Bush and the Trump administrations. I'm currently sitting on a congressional commission as a Republican commissioner on the Strategic Posture Commission of the United States. So I think my background informed the book in a lot of ways, but maybe I'll highlight two things. One, we wanted this book to be comprehensive. People have written books recently on China or on climate, but we wanted to do the whole picture. And so I think we do provide a comprehensive view for what American national security strategy should look like going forward. We have chapters on China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, allies, climate, border, et cetera. So it's a one-stop shop. And then second, it's a book about conservative foreign policy written by conservatives. And I think that often the people who are writing about foreign affairs are Democrats or progressives. And so when they write about conservatives, they're almost writing about them as a exotic tribe in a faraway land. They don't really understand them. But all my friends and family back in Missouri are Trump supporters. Dan and I are both conservatives, have worked in conservative administrations. And so I think it's a book by conservatives for conservatives, and from conservatives. And I should just point out, the Atlantic Council is a nonpartisan organization. Our bosses would be happy if we said that this is our views. The book doesn't represent the official views of the Atlantic Council.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's a very important aspect there. But it is great that you guys are doing this because I think, Dan and I were talking before the show. One of my biggest critiques that I would have, as a former Republican administration official myself as well, having served in the Trump administration, is the fact that we have not got enough voices on national security and foreign policy. And I understand why, obviously 20 years of GWAT environment and various troubles at home makes a lot of sense as to why folks are focused more inward. But it's very important that I think we have that voice on the stage, right, and present that, which is exactly why I wanted you all to be my first interview. I do want to dive into specifically what you guys describe as the new Cold War, because I think, one, it's a very apt term, and I think your book details fairly well as to why it is the case. But I get the sense, and by all means, correct me if I'm wrong, that there is still a lack of urgency on this point and a lack of understanding on this point. I think not just in conservative circles, but across the board. Could you all delve a little bit into what you see this Cold War as and what needs to be done in order to address the threat posed by China?
Well, let me first define the term and then define who our adversaries are, which is a plural. So a Cold War is a situation where two countries or two groups of countries face each other as adversaries over an extended period of time. And there is a determined attempt to counter the actions of the other country or group of countries. And change a certain set of circumstances. So the situation that we are facing right now is that China, but not just China, also Russia, also Iran, and also North Korea are acting in a coordinated fashion. They're not formal allies, and there is no committee where they meet and they plan things, and they have no regular meetings, but they do coordinate with each other. And their objective is to upend the international system that was created by the United States, together with its allies at the end of the Second World War, and what we felt was very important was to offer this view of the current situation as an alternative to what we are getting from the Biden administration. So, for example, in the book and also in a separate article, Matt and I wrote that we disagree with the definition that we hear often from the Biden administration, that in our relations with China, we have three kinds of interface. We are competing, we are cooperating, and we are confronting. And what we are saying is there is no competition with China, because competition is, let's say, tennis, where we are on another side of a net and we play nicely against each other trying to score points, but there is a referee and we stop if something, while China is cheating. And there is no cooperation because usually on cooperation, the Biden administration offers climate change and COVID. In climate change, China is the greatest polluter, and in COVID, they're not allowing investigation of what happened, that they're lying there as well. So then we're left with confrontation. Well, then let's call it a confrontation. Let's not call it competition. Recently, Jake Sullivan offered something else, which I thought was interesting, which was strategic competition in conditions of interdependence. Interdependence is not an inescapable condition that we need to live with. Both the United States and its allies and China are moving away from this interdependence through de-risk. And so we felt that this new Cold War definition is the right framing of where we are, and it's an important contribution to the conversation.
Absolutely. Matt, anything to add on that?
Well, again, I agree with everything Dan said, and we really do see these issues similarly, which made it easy to write the book. I would just add, some people say, well, it's not really a Cold War because it's different from the last Cold War. And of course, if what people mean by Cold War, is it exactly like the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union in the second half of the 20th century? Of course not. But it is a competition for the future of global order between the United States and autocratic great power rivals. And so in that sense, there are a lot of similarities. And so I guess I'd also add that in terms of what we do about it, we see similarities as well. Reagan said his goal for the first Cold War was we win, they lose. And we think the same thing here. Many people say, oh, the goal should be, competitive coexistence with the Chinese Communist Party. But I don't want to be on the verge of World War III with a genocidal communist nuclear armed dictatorship forever. I think we want to bring this to a close in a way that advances American and allied national security. And so we try to lay out a strategy for doing that in the book.
Yeah, that's total. I'm glad you guys made that distinction, because I think that we see a lot of people dismiss the threat. When folks mention that we're in a new Cold War, they dismiss the threat and try to hash out these, splitting hairs, right, on, well, it's not quite like the Soviet Union, and that's why it's not a Cold War. Well, okay, great. World War I wasn't much like World War II. They were still both world wars, right? And so, it's very frustrating having these discussions. And as someone, I've been trying to sound the alarm of the China threat myself. You make a good point there, and I actually would posit that this Cold War is more dangerous because of the fact that China does have the economic capability and some of the influence and the financing that the Soviet Union didn't have. And that's what particularly worries me, is that there is, and then of course you add in the fact that they have the technological options available to them that the Soviets did not have. It is pretty scary, but I think it's important to hash down into exactly what is it that China wants to do in terms of shifting the global order that's existed. I'm reading Elizabeth Economy's book right now on this, which I think I would highly recommend to everybody, where she kind of explains the world that China sees. It's fascinating. But what does the end state look like in your minds that China is trying to achieve?
Maybe I'll take this one first.
Sure. Yeah.
Or do you want to?
Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, well, Elizabeth Economy is a smart analyst. I also liked her previous book on the 3 Chinese revolutions, including talking about Xi's revolution and the very different direction he's taking China in. But I think China has several goals. One, like many autocratic regimes, its number one goal is regime stability. They are very paranoid about their ability to hang on to power. And if you just follow the money, they spend more money on domestic repression than they do on their militaries. Again, you follow the money, the greatest threat is their own people, not the United States or the Department of Defense. Second, they want to establish dominance in Asia. They're very clear about this. They want to, they see the U.S. alliances as relics of the Cold War. They want to break our alliances, force the United States out of Asia. And then third, they want global supremacy. And again, it's not our paranoid thoughts. Just read Xi Jinping's speeches that have been collected into books. He's talked about this a lot, that China should be at the center of the international system in the dominant position by 2049, the 100th year anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. So just like the United States and its allies set up an international system conducive to our interests when we were on top after World War II, China wants to revise the system, set up an international system more consistent with its worldview. And so that would mean consistent with its autocratic political model instead of a rules-based system. And there are problems with that term, but there's some truth to it. They want a system that's determined by their whims and their dictates. And so this would mean a world that's much less safe, much less free, and much less prosperous for the United States and our allies. So it's a nightmare scenario. Imagine if Hitler had won World War II. Imagine if the Soviet Union had won the Cold War. These are the stakes. Do we want the globe to be governed by the United States and its democratic allies, or a hostile communist regime in Beijing?
Dan, anything to add to that?
Yeah, so a few little things. So first of all, I think it's important when we think about the comparison between Cold War I and Cold War II, to recognize that despite what some people are saying, that in the first Cold War, we had a communist ideology that was animating the Soviet Union and China and their satellite countries. And this time there is no ideology. Actually, there is ideology that is common between the countries in the new axis of evil. And this ideology is authoritarianism. They all have in common the idea that domestically they can, the dictators running these countries should be able to continue to do so. But the other aspect of authoritarianism is revisionism. Every single one of these 4 key members of the axis of evil, and I say key members, some people throw in there Venezuela and Syria and so on, but for now, let's stay with the four big ones. They all have territorial claims against their neighbors. They all want to intervene in the affairs of their neighbors and intervene, as Matt was saying, even far away. Russia intervened in the US elections. China intervened in the affairs of countries around the world if they said something against the regime in China. So I think that is really important, and we should recognize that there is an ideology that they propose and that is attractive to other dictators.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? You hear a lot of people discussing, America on the decline, and the world order that was created post Cold War I, is fracturing. Some might say there's 20 years of global war on terrorism that I think a lot of folks point to as an example of that deterioration. United States general American electorate is probably not too keen on engaging in another large-scale ground war specifically. How do you think that impacts the mentality as we start pivoting towards this new Cold War threat?
Well, for my, as I mentioned, I have a PhD in political science. And one thing that political scientists think they know is that actually the American public doesn't have strong views on foreign policy, that they know they're not experts. And so they follow the signals from the leaders of their party or other elites in journalism that they respect. And so I think you're right that the American people aren't ready for a new Cold War right now. But I think that's in part the problem of our political leadership, because they haven't adequately explained it to the American people. And so there are some efforts underway. The China Committee and Congress, led by Mike Gallagher, who endorsed the back of our book. Others, I think President Trump deserves a lot of credit for declaring great power competition with Russia and China, the foremost threat facing the country. And I think our political leadership needs to do a much better job of explaining the threats posed. And it's economic, it's technological, it's ideological. As Dan said, it's military, so it's a comprehensive threat. We're going to need a comprehensive strategy to deal with this. And this is going to require sacrifices. We likely will have to increase military spending. We're at historical lows as a military spending as a percent of GDP. But I think the American people are adults. If you explain to them the stakes and what it's going to do to secure American interests, I think they will support this.
Yes.
So I would love to add something here. Our adversaries are helping a lot in convincing the American people to become more interested in foreign affairs, because they do such horrendous things that infuriate Americans and their sense of fairness. For example, you look at China with its unfair trading practices. You don't need a PhD from Georgetown, where Matt is teaching, to understand that when an American company is competing with a Chinese company and the Chinese company is getting preferential loans from the Chinese government, is exploiting workers in Xinjiang, they use slave labor, they do not respect environmental rules, and that's a cost to American companies, that the Chinese company is cheating, and that the American companies put at a disadvantage. And that's just not fair. They also, again, you don't need a PhD from anywhere to see that the Chinese steal intellectual property. Again, it's all. And then you hear about Russia, and Russia invading an independent country, neighboring country, bombing maternity wards. It is infuriating to hear that. Or in Iran, a young lady doesn't have the scarf properly put on her head and they beat her to death. So actions like this, and in North Korea, Kim Jong-un executed his uncle with an aircraft gun. I mean, you hear these things, and then you hear that these are our adversaries. The American people will pay attention, and they are helping us pay attention.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think you're right. It does come down to political leadership. Because I think, you're right. A lot of folks, they don't know what they don't know. And not every American citizen has the time to delve into the president's budget requests and other things like that, or the national defense strategy the way that we might, which, is really why I think that, what I'm trying to do is kind of highlight that we do need to speak to that audience and help them get informed. So I'm grateful that you guys brought that up. One thing I think that's really timely in our discussion is Matt, you mentioned the defense budget, which we just got the request this week as we're recording, and $850 billion top line, which of course is a lot of money. I always try to be clear with folks that we here in DC tend to look at billions of dollars as we would a rounding error, but it is a lot of money. So obviously that's true. But I think you hit on a very important point. As a percentage of GDP, we are below our average in the last 50 years. And there's a lot of cuts in this budget to what would be, we would consider hardware and things that are, hard power. It's interesting, right? Because you also have the Biden administration sounding the alarm on Russia in particular, and their own defense strategy states that we are seeing significant threats from China and Iran as well. Where's the disconnect? Why is there a disconnect between what we're hearing and what we're seeing in legislative action?
Well, I think this is a problem with the Biden administration's approach to defense. They say that we can walk and chew gum at the same time. They say that we can do it all. They're saying that we will defend Taiwan if it's invaded, that we can support Ukraine and Israel. But then when you take inflation into account, their requests for the defense budget have essentially been cutting defense spending, even as they're increasing spending in other places. And so we don't have what we need right now for a conventional defense of Taiwan, the number one pacing threat from China. Ask any military expert on that. But we don't just have to deal with China. We also have to deal with Russia, Iran, North Korea. So we're nowhere near where we need to be in terms of a conventional force posture. There have been bipartisan defense panels set up by Congress for years, recommending increases to the defense budget. And instead, again, after inflation, we're cutting. And again, to put it in historical perspective, during the Cold War, we spent about an average, it fluctuated, but an average of 7% of GDP per year. Now we're at about 3.5%. So this is the lowest level, near the lowest levels of defense spending as a percent of GDP since World War II. And so we're not taking this threat seriously. If we believe the challenges and the dangerous security environment, and I do, and I believe the Biden administration understands the threat, then let's put our money where our mouth is. Let's build the defense that we need to actually keep the American people safe.
Yeah, and I will add to this that if we are after inflation not increasing but cutting, and if you look at the latest budget, the U.S. Spending on defense is actually decreasing in future years. It also puts us in the wrong posture towards our allies in Europe. Matt and I wrote an article recently together with General co-authored with General Todd Walters, the former Allied Supreme Commander, NATO in Europe, arguing that European allies of the United States should no longer have 2% as their target for spending of GDP per capita, but rather 3%, which was the absolute minimum during the previous Cold War in Europe. But if the and the argument that we are making there was, look, we are at 3.5%. You guys should be like us, and you should be at least at 3%. But if we are decreasing our military spending, on what basis do we ask our European partners to increase their spending? And just the other day, the president and prime minister of Poland visited the White House, and President Duda asked President Biden to advocate for 3% as the new basis for spending in for European allies of the United States. And the White House put out a press release afterwards. It's saying it's overly ambitious. For now, let's make sure everybody's at 2%. But that's not the right message. If Europe is faced with an existential threat from the Russians, which they are, they should be like the Poles who are at 4%. Countries facing existential threats are at 4% or more. Israel is at 4.5%. So it is not the right message, what we hear from the White House on defense.
I'm glad you guys brought that up, because there's a lot of discussions amongst, especially I think in the Republican circles, and obviously President Trump brought this up quite a bit during his time, that we have, I think the last number I remember is well over 50% of the alliance in NATO is not meeting their 2% guideline, right? That we all agreed to. And I find it interesting because some of these same voices are also the ones calling on the United States to step up and ensure that we can properly fund Ukrainians, which of course, we can understand that, that fight and that's how important that is. But it's very interesting to me because you'll often hear folks say, well, what does 2% from Lithuania matter in the grand scheme when we're taking on large partners? And now I've always countered and said, well, it's an outward expression of an inward belief. It signals to our adversaries that we are serious about this. So if you could delve in a little bit about why that matters, because obviously there are a lot of smaller partners in the NATO alliance who are not going to provide the kind of just general quantity, but delve into a little bit about why it matters that we're all on the same page with spending.
Well, the percentage of GDP spent on defense is the outward sign of the determination of a country to be serious about its national security. It's a shorthand, just like GDP per capita is a shorthand for the economic and generally societal development of a country, unless they have too much natural resources and so on. But it is a very important benchmark, and it is difficult to get to that number. The government of a country, assuming they're all democratic, they would have to go to their parliament, and their members of the legislature will have to go to their voters and say, we need to reallocate the budget towards away from social spending, which we all like. All kinds of goodies coming from the government, and we need to spend on our defense. It is difficult, but and this is why it is. I was very disappointed by the recent statement from the White House discouraging the Poles for asking the 3%. Because Russ, you're absolutely right. This is the same administration that is demanding that the American people send more money to Ukraine. I cannot understand why the argument should not be that we should ask the Europeans to spend more money on a war on their continent. It is, interesting in light of that. Prime Minister Orban of Hungary visited former President Trump, and there was a question of what was said, and the Trump campaign put out a press release afterwards saying what former President Trump said was that the Europeans should spend more money for their defense. After all, it's on their continent, and we are an ocean away. And it is the right position to take on this. The countries that are the nearest should make a substantial effort, at least equal and preferably more than the United States in supporting Ukraine.
Excellent.
I could just, I again agree with everything Dan said. I'll just add 2 points. One, forget which example you used, Russ. Seems like you said one of the Baltic states. So you're right that if the Baltic states spend 2%, it's, they're not buying aircraft carriers with that. They're small economies. But actually the Baltic states, countries on the front line, for the most part, those are the countries meeting the 2% obligation. But you have big economies that haven't been meeting their 2% obligation. Countries like Germany, France, Spain, Italy, those are bigger economies. Spending 2% there can give you real military capabilities that we need. And so the Germans this year say they're going to hit 2% for the first time, which is great. I hope they do that and stay there, but other countries need to step up. And then the second point is it's not just a matter of fairness. It's really about the capabilities we need to deter World War III. And as I said before, the United States doesn't have what it needs, and the United States can't do it all on its own. We need our allies to do their part. And NATO has announced new regional plans, really the first serious defense plans for Europe since the end of the Cold War. And the estimates are that to get the capabilities we need, NATO's Supreme Allied Commander, to execute those plans, that countries are going to have to spend 3% on GDP, but 2% is not enough. Dan and I had an op-ed recently with the former Supreme Allied Commander saying that NATO should go to 3%. And so it is a matter of fairness, but it's also just about defending the free world and having the capabilities we need to do that.
Excellent point. Yeah. So getting back to just the new Cold War in general, what does winning look like? In the case of the Soviet Union, Reagan made it very clear, as you guys note in the book, that winning was, we win, they lose. Ultimately, the dissolution of the Soviet Union. However, as Dan noted, there are still communist regimes in this world. So communism as an ideology in total has not been eradicated. China is an ancient culture and society that's been around for 2,000, 3,000 plus years. So clearly there's going to be a space for China to be in some capacity. What does winning look like in this new Cold War?
So we had the great honor that Secretary Pompeo made us to write a foreword to our book. And he took a formulation from our book and reworded it, and he reworded it better. This is why he was Secretary of State. I wasn't. He said, winning means either capitulation or incapacitation of the Chinese. And let me elaborate on that. The way we wrote it in the book, first of all, we want to make sure that we are not advocating for a war. Winning is not as a result of a kinetic conflict, but it's winning in the ideal way, which is we prepare for war to preserve the peace. But we are deterring our adversaries so that they do not hurt us. They do not affect our vital and important national interests. So we wanted to be in a position in which the Chinese either give up because the cost of opposing the United States are too high, or through our actions we take away from them their ability to hurt us. And again, this is how we put it in the book. And then Secretary Pompeo in his introduction called it capitulation or incapacitation of the Chinese, and this is also true for the other members of the new axis of evil. And finally, the other point is, while we wish their people, the people in these adversary countries, the best, and we wish them to live in freedom the way we live in freedom, we are not necessarily aspiring to change the regime in those countries. If that happens, that's great, and we are supporting their aspirations, but this is not an aspect of winning where we define winning by a leader or a form of government being toppled.
Yeah, I think that's an important note to make, that, there's more to it than just a kinetic war over Taiwan or something like that. It's a cultural, socioeconomic, and in some cases, hardware argument. So I want to respect your guys' time here. So I want to get into one question for each of you. One question. I want both your answers. 3 things that the next Republican administration needs to change or do to win the next Cold War.
Great. Well, I can go. I can go first. First thing I'd say is increase defense spending to get back to the kind of Cold War levels that we're going to need. Second, I would say to encourage our allies to do more, and many administrations have been saying this for a long time. But if you just look at the data, the first Trump administration had the most success. European defense spending increased the most under Trump. Declined initially under Biden and then went back up after the second Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I do think that a second Trump administration could be effective at getting our European allies to step up and do their part. And then third, like during the first Cold War, I think the United States is going to need to rely on nuclear deterrence more. And as I mentioned, I was fortunate to be appointed by Congress to a commission on the Strategic Posture Commission of the United States. So 6 Democrats, 6 Republicans, and we came to a unanimous conclusion that the United States is essentially going to have to engage in its first strategic forces buildup since the end of the Cold War. By the way, this is something that both Trump and Reagan liked. Reagan, of course, helped to end the first Cold War by investments in strategic forces, and the promise of a Star Wars missile defense system was part of what convinced the Soviet Union to concede. And Trump has similar instincts. In his first term, he said he wanted a state-of-the-art missile defense system, a top-of-the-pack nuclear arsenal, and I suspect that he would bring those instincts with him into a second term as well. So there are many other things that we need to do. We spell them out in the book, specific recommendations for climate, border, and other things. But those are 3 that I would highlight that I think are especially important for the defense part of the strategy.
So Matt all went first and he got all the good ones. Wow. But look, here is what I would say, sort of priorities and urgencies. Number 1, end the war in Ukraine. And we wrote in the book, and Matt and I also worked on this separately, on the very different strategies or definition of the policy between what the Biden administration is pursuing and what we are hearing from the Trump campaign, where in the Trump campaign, the emphasis is to end the conflict as soon as possible, to stop the killing, and to build from there. So this would be an urgent objective and an important one. The next one would be the border. The open border, our open southern border, is a national security threat. Millions of people, some people are saying 8 million if you don't count the known gonaways. We are learning this very strange terms, the known gotaways and unknown gotaways, meaning people you see that they are getting away, and the people you assume got away because so many people you know that they are also managing to escape detection. So the numbers are between 8 and 10 million people. 9 terrorists caused the death of 3,000 Americans. The director of the FBI recently gave a deposition saying it is very reasonable to assume that there will be terrorists crossing the border with the aim of hurting America. This has to stop. The other issue is when we think of the strategic capabilities of the United States, a key strategic capability is its energy resources. For the national security standing of the United States, for its ability to counter its adversaries, we need to put climate change in its proper place, away from the top of the national security priorities of this country, which is where the Biden administration put it, and move it down as a problem to be managed, but not an existential threat. Once we do that, we will free up our ability to produce energy, and we will also solve this very incomprehensible decisions where the Biden administration is not allowing new LNG terminals to be built and recently stopped the exports of LNG. And then our allies in Europe, who we want to wean off energy from Russia, need to resort to non-American sources for energy when we would much rather be the ones delivering. So these would be my 3 next priorities.
Well, you both just outlined some great ideas for me in future episodes, so I appreciate the free labor there. Much appreciated. Well, much appreciated, folks, for this. This has been a great discussion. I think I want one thing that, if you would just permit me, one more question that's a little different, but I think is very important. One of my goals through this and, various other ventures is to spark interest, especially amongst younger voters, younger people in national security and foreign policy. We obviously are seeing a huge problem with military recruitment. We're seeing a huge problem with people getting interest in public service and on these issues. At one point, we were all young fellas trying to make our way up through this space. What is one piece of advice you would give to young people who are interested in this kind of work or these kind of ideas?
Well, let me go first this time. Read history. Read history, which will teach you that peace may look wonderful at one point or another, but there is evil in the world, there is danger in the world, and our country needs to be so strong that nobody dare threaten our freedoms and our peace and our prosperity. And young people will learn this by studying the history of the United States and of the world.
My advice would be, if you think you might be interested in a career in foreign affairs and national security, I would encourage you to pursue that passion. Sometimes people say, well, life is short. And in a way that's true, but if you're waking up every single day to an alarm clock, sitting in rush hour traffic, doing a job 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week that you don't enjoy, that you think, why am I even doing this? That's a long, unhappy life. Working in national security policy, I've never felt that. We're working on the most important issues in the world, literally dealing with issues of war and peace. The issues you grapple with in a career in national security are on the front page of the newspaper, top of the fold, almost every day. And so, like anything, it's not perfect, but I think if you go into this career field, you'll feel like you're making a difference and that what you do really does matter.
Excellent. And hey, maybe check out Georgetown and you can learn from the man himself, right? That would be great.
Please apply to Georgetown, apply for jobs at the Atlantic Council, come work with Dan and me. We'd love to have you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, gents, I appreciate the conversation. This has been great. And where can folks get the book?
I'd recommend they go to Amazon. It's on Amazon again. We win, they lose.
There it is.
Foreign policy of the new Cold War. And a nice forward from Mike Pompeo, as Dan mentioned. And so check it out and hope you enjoy it.
Awesome. And when's it releasing again?
Next week, March 19th.
March 19th. Excellent. All right. Well, if folks are listening to this, it'll be out by then. So go buy it, go check it out on Amazon and enjoy the read. It's very digestible. I really appreciate that you guys made it such an easy, good read, but very thorough as well. So
thank you very much, Russ, and good luck with your podcast. New aspects of your podcast.
Appreciate that. Thank you very much to you both. And that'll do it. Thanks, guys.
Thanks. Bye-bye.